Okay, now we have arrived at the time of the evening where we are at our interview, and we are thrilled this evening. And if you could put us in spotlight, Michael, we're thrilled this evening to have Aaron Kreisberg from Catalina Conservancy. And I'm a big fan of him and his work. He's been a real kind person in terms of interacting with our organization, talking to me about things, and just giving me pointers and tips. And so we're really privileged to have him here tonight. Aaron, if you have not turned your camera on, you have to turn your camera on for us to be able to spotlight you, I think is the way that works. But I know he's in the room because I saw him a second ago. So we're very privileged to have Aaron with us this evening, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you great, loud and clear.
Excellent.
So
Good
what we
deal.
do usually in this is, as we discussed, we're not just here to talk about your work today. We're here to talk about your climate journey and how you became an advocate, how you got involved in the work that you do, and kind of to give people an insight as to how climate careers can come in many different forms and how your path led you to where you are today. Could you give us kind of the history of how you got on this path and the steps along the way? Looks like he froze. Now, did I freeze or did he freeze? Because that's the way these things often go. Andy, I can see your face. Can you can still hear me, but you can't hear?
I can hear you, but
Okay. So I believe Aaron is out on the island, and so I think they have perfectly good internet there typically. I've actually been out there and held meetings there, but it looks like he may have dropped off. So we're going to just talk a little bit about Catalina Conservancy while he comes back. But roughly Catalina Island, I think, and I'm going off of memory of these things because I wasn't prepared to talk about this part, but I think that the island's about 27 miles long. I have done the hike of the island from one side to the other, and it's a lot of different terrain, and some of it's mountainous, some of it's coastal, obviously. And in the middle of the island it's almost really two islands because it comes to a point in an area called Two Harbors. There he's back.
I'm
I was
back.
filling. I was giving people just a little bit of an overview of Catalina Island, but we'll pick up where we were on the interview, and then we'll talk a little bit about Catalina in a bit.
Good. I'm glad I'm back. Sorry I disappeared across the
All
channel
good.
there briefly.
So tell us a little bit about your journey and how you kind of got into this work, where you're from originally, and how it all kind
Yeah,
of ended up where you are.
sure. So I'm actually originally grew up in Huntington Beach for the most part. Lived in LA County before that, but we moved when I was about 7 and pretty regular Orange County childhood for the most part. And then we camped a bit. So wasn't like I was totally inside all the time, but we'd go to Yosemite, that kind of stuff. But then I went to UC Santa Barbara, did an undergraduate degree up there, and kind of coalesced towards water resources and hydrology as an interest. So that was one of my undergraduate degrees was hydrological sciences, and kind of thought, oh, there will always be jobs in California and water, and learned a lot about the water system. So it was very interesting to hear about some of the DWP stuff earlier, and was just out in the Eastern Sierra last weekend again. So I still think about the water issues a lot, but not really something I spend time with professionally at this point. And as an undergraduate, the kind of two additional like extracurricular things I did were I did habitat restoration through a group called the Cheadle Center for Biodiversity and Ecological Restoration at UC Santa Barbara. I was a student worker for them, so kind of got my introduction to like what's a native plant, what's a non-native plant, like hey, this is what habitat restoration looks like. And then I also was part of the UC Santa Barbara adventure program, so did kayak sort of stuff, and kayaking's fun. So then after undergrad, I kind of got split between those two things as professional careers, and then funnily enough, the outdoor recreation one actually became like my career. So I spent a good close 10 years off and on working on Santa Cruz Island, so one of the other Channel Islands, part of Channel Islands National Park. So I actually would do sea cave kayaking tours out there, so I got to spend a lot of time on the water out
I've
there.
been on those. Those are
Yeah,
fantastic. Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty special if folks have, I mean, obviously Catalina is kind of the main well-known Channel Island, but if folks get up to Ventura and go out to Channel Islands National Park, Santa Rosa is not open right now because folks may have heard about the fire out there. So Santa Rosa just went through a wildfire, but the caves on Santa Cruz are a lot of fun. So I was doing that and it was a lot of fun. But then eventually it was like, hey, I kind of want to go back to school. I'd rather be the person instead of taking people kayaking and talking about all the cool stuff happening on the island. I wanted to be the getting to help do some of that work. So I actually went back to graduate school after a working holiday in New Zealand, got to go down there for about half a year, right around when COVID started, and then came back and did a 2-year master's at UC Santa Barbara, where I did my undergrad, also the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. So did a 2-year master's there, a very professionally focused program, and kind of did a specialization in conservation planning. Knew I really wanted to get in conservation. That's kind of where I got back into botany too. So really, rather than just kind of habitat restoration, here's a plant, like more actual botany, keying plants, and that's kind of where a lot of my professional interests lie at this point. So then got a job with Channel Islands Restoration after doing my graduate work, and then was there for about a year. And I'd been involved with that organization at other points. They're up in Santa Barbara area. And then the job came up on Catalina in 2023, and I applied for it and was able to get a job kind of managing the plant program out here. And now I'm pretty much focused on invasive plants for my day job. So think about weeds is the fun way to put it. But yeah, so it was a little circuitous, but UC Santa Barbara was very formative at both the undergraduate and graduate levels to that. And I even remember kind of as an undergrad thinking, wow, I could get a job where I'm outside. And I am not out. I mean, I live on Catalina. I'm in Avalon full time. Our office is out in the middle of the island, but I don't, do spend a lot of time at a computer these days.
I hear you. So before we go into details about your work today, what has it been like to adjust to living on an island and kind of, not,
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a fun little part of LA County that we don't all think of all the time, unless, especially when it's not clear from the mainland. You're kind of like out of sight, out of mind, it feels like out here. Not so much this time of year, because we're definitely in the swing of the busy season out here in terms of visitation. 4th of July is really big out here. If anybody's a big USC fan, the marching band comes out here every year for the 4th of July and does the parade sort of thing. So it's a big thing out here, but it's different. There's trade-offs is the way I often think of it. And in general, for me and my family, the trade-offs outweigh the negatives. But we do only have a Vons. So if you're really into like having good options for where you shop, it's not a great place in that sense. I mean, driving, you don't get on the freeway. That's one of the big positives in my view. One of the challenges of when I do go out here, it's called going over town when you go to the mainland. I don't use that too much, but yeah, if you're going to the mainland, it's I'm going over town. So it's good to get over every once in a while, because if you're out here like I just had a couple trips off, and before that I hadn't been off the island for about 2+ months, and it is good to like go remind yourself that there's a whole wide world out there beyond Catalina.
right, right,
But
I bet.
yeah.
So let's talk about kind of Catalina Island. The Conservancy covers, I believe, roughly 90% of the
Yeah,
island, and
88. Yeah.
the part that's not Avalon or the two harbors specifically, essentially. And can you talk about kind of the larger mission of the Conservancy,
Hmm.
and then you know, and then we'll talk more about plants and specific.
Of course. Yeah, and I got all excited during the show and tell of the photos. I was like seeing the photos and I was like, "Oh no, should I show slides?" And I didn't prepare any slides, but I've got like a good Calypsy presentation I did a couple of years ago, the California Invasive Plant Council, that has some maps, but I don't need to show it. So like you said, it's about 48 the island's about 48,000 acres, and the Conservancy owns and manages about 42,000 of those acres. And so what's not, and for folks who maybe haven't heard some of the history before, I mean, I think most folks have heard of Wrigley chewing gum, and if anybody's a baseball person, and the Chicago Cubs, the Wrigley Field, it was the Wrigley family that actually owned nearly the whole island back in the 1920s. 1919-ish. Wrigley actually acquired the whole island, and then it was his adult children towards the end of their lives that created the Conservancy. So our organization was spun off from the Island Company back in the 1970s. So we just had our 50th anniversary, I think, around when I started working here, which was 2023. So the Conservancy's been around for over 50 years at this point, one of the kind of older land trust style organizations in the state of California. And yeah, we do own and manage 42,000 acres. And then for my purview, I kind of think about it as a whole island, because there are plants that I'm concerned from a management perspective that are beyond that Conservancy landholding. It always sounds a little goofy. I always say the Conservancy only owns 88% of the island, and I always kind of get this funny look from folks when I say that. And as Charles said, yeah, it's kind of the areas around Avalon. There are private property owners in Avalon, so there are actually folks, there's families out here that predate the Wrigley ownership of the island, so multi-generational islander families. There are still Tongva Gabrielino individuals living on the island. So there's a very robust culture out here of kind of an islander culture, very self-reliant, different jobs in different sectors. I mean, we have a K through 12 school out here that's through Long Beach Unified School District. We have a health system. So we have kind of everything you would think. And yeah, kind of the Conservancy's mission, we have this three-part mission that's focused on conservation, where kind of I spend my day job and my department mates spend their day job, but we also have an educational aspect to the mission. So providing educational aspects for school groups, that sort of thing, adult education. So I think some folks may have been out on some of our outings before. The education department I got to do a watercolor workshop they put on like a year ago. So they'll do some interesting things like that. And then recreation, of course. The Trans-Catalina Trail at this point it's been around, I want to say, for about 15, 20 years. Yeah, probably 15-ish. The Trans-Catalina Trail is probably like one of the bigger backpacking draws in the Southern California region at this point. We get both local and out of state and even international people who come here to hike from Two Harbors to Avalon pretty much. And there's a little loop you can do on the west end. And then of course, within that recreation aspect, there's kind of tours you can do where you go out in the interior. I'm sure we'll be on the plants. We'll get into some of the wildlife you can see out here, and there's bison, so that remains a big point of interest. People like seeing bison in the interior. So
So
that's kind
tell
of the
me
mission
about,
and the conservancy.
yeah, well, that's great. That's a great overview, and it is an absolutely wonderful way to get back to nature because it's so much more than Avalon. If you haven't been out
Yeah.
there, people hear about the little beach town, but it's tremendous living ecosystem with all kinds of sub ecosystems within it. And having done that hike, you get to see all that kind of stuff from one end to the other. So tell us a little bit about your specific work. We a lot of people might be aware that islands have endemics, special plants that only exist there and nowhere else. And everybody who's been to any of our meetings have heard me yammer on forever about native plants. I won't shut up about it. But tell us a little bit about you dealing with the other side of that coin, which is the invasive plants that I think mostly have been introduced in the last 200 years, and kind of the challenges that poses and why we should care about that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think it is something that doesn't always end up in the forefront of folks' mind. I mean, I think I find that it's a lot more exciting sometimes to think about the unique native endemics. But I mean, to me, it's kind of two sides of a coin where you don't have those resources protected if you don't think about that other aspect. And so, yeah, we have about 700 plants on Catalina, if you count how many, like, if you really want to get
700
botanically.
species. Yeah.
Yeah, 700 exactly. Yeah, not 700 plants total. Of those of some of those species, there's one in particular, the Catalina Island mahogany, that there's actually only six genetically pure individuals on the island. So that's a federally and state endangered species. So some of these native species that are actually federally or state listed, we as a landowner actually have an obligation to manage these species under the Endangered Species Act and the California Endangered Species Act. But of those 700 species, it would be about a third of them are non-native. And then within that third, so about 200 plus, I would classify a third of that, maybe a little less, as like invasive. So, and I think I won't go too into the nitty gritty on that yet, but it's inherently, I think I saw a good talk recently for somebody from the California Invasive Plant Council, and their point was that there's basically probably no invasive plant manager in the state of California who feels like they have all the resources they need to accomplish everything. And it's kind of one of those things where you're never going to get to everything you work towards. So kind of thinking about what it looks like, I mean, and I think it's a very interesting thing because on a good day I look at the landscape out here and I'm like, wow, we've got oaks out here that you can't find really anywhere else in the region, or you don't see oak woodland like this on the mainland. But then around Avalon, and yeah, you're dead on with saying it's beyond. There's a lot more to Catalina than just Avalon. I think the typical experience is folks, I think, come out for a day trip and they probably rent a golf cart, they walk around Avalon, they get something to eat, they maybe get some drinks, maybe they get in the water. I mean, and I think that's a really good way to experience Catalina, is to get in the water to snorkel. We've got some pretty amazing marine resources out here, so that's the whole part of it. I'm not going to hit on much because that's not really what my work takes me towards, but I think that's an
Sure.
important part to remind folks too is that there's a huge, amazing marine environment out here and some marine protected areas, and especially up on the west end by Two Harbors. But yeah, back to the terrestrial aspect. I mean, and you are right about the introductions kind of dominating towards the last 200 years. I mean, when you speak of, you kind of think about colonization and livestock getting brought over. So some things have been around pretty much since Spanish contact. The Spanish brought some things over, but a lot of the stuff I deal with was actually intentional or horticultural introductions that were then kind of prepped out. So it's something I like encouraging and folks to think about is that aspect of like you might plant something in your garden you just think it's pretty, and then all of a sudden that's the thing that's now eaten your whole. If you're in kind of a wildland urban interface area, it might become the dominant vegetation behind your property, and we've
So
seen versions of that here.
has a lot of that of what we're talking about been plants that have escaped from Avalon, just people planting non-native plants
The best
recreationally?
example, I mean, and if folks spend much time in the national forests around Southern California, the Angeles, etc., you've probably seen Spanish broom, which pretty yellow flowers. You'll see it along like kind of the Caltrans buffers, or like I'm sure if you go up on Angeles Crest, stuff like that, you see it up there. So the number one plant I spend time thinking about and dealing with is actually called Mediterranean broom. So it is a species of broom. The brooms are actually in the pea family, Fabiaceae. So a lot of them are nitrogen fixers. And if anybody spent a lot of time up in Northern California, you've maybe seen French broom, and then there's another one called Scotch broom. So all these brooms do really well. And I get the pleasure of dealing with a species of broom that's actually not really invasive anywhere else in the state of California. And that's not probably for lack of its potential to be invasive. It's likely just it wasn't introduced at those times. Actually, where there's the casino, which is a really well-known building out here, probably our most well-known building, and it's not a gambling casino. It's a big white building with a tile roof, 12 stories tall. At the time it was built, I think it was the tallest building in Los Angeles County. So it's built out at the point west of Avalon, and the next cove over is Descanso Canyon, and that used to be the St. Catherine's Hotel. It's now the Descanso Beach Club, so very popular place for folks to go visit when they come here. But when it was the hotel, that broom actually was planted as landscaping there. And so that was back in the 19 teens, 1920s, that ballpark. And the first, hopefully, we'll have our third flora of the island published very soon. But the first flora, which is basically a botanical document that kind of describes the plants of a place. The first flora for Catalina was published in the 1920s, and the authors actually described genus Delinifolia, the Mediterranean broom, as does not seem to be naturalizing. It was all kind of in one place. And I mean, there's entire drainages on this side of the island where I am that are dominated by that
Yeah.
plant at
I
this
think
point.
I feel it's important.
Oh, I didn't disappear this time. And Charles left us with a good cliffhanger there too. It's important. Oh, he's back faster than me though. And I saw, I guess I can pause. I saw there was a resource conservation district question about, and it is correct that we are in the Santa Monica Mountains RCD. Catalina kind of, I think, sneaks under the radar sometimes. I have spoken to folks at the RCD before. I think they get really busy with some of the stuff they have going on in the actual Santa Monica Mountains proper. So, not much engagement on a formal level, but if you have connections, always happy to talk to them. I know Dan Cooper's really involved, and I've crossed paths with him a couple times. So, would definitely be open to formal stuff. But I think Topanga is like their big focus, and I think especially with the fire, they've been pretty involved with. And I know they do some events of getting, but not on a formal level, engagement wise. But would love to keep conversations going.
Dude, I don't know what's happening tonight. We've got like you fell off and then I fell off. I've never fallen
I
off during a
I
meeting.
thought it was me at first, so
Yeah, it's not you, it's me kind of a thing. Yes, all right. Continuing what I said, I was busy pointlessly jumping in probably just to point out we have and some things that are called broom that are native as well. So it's not,
yes.
yeah. So
Yeah, and I saw there was a good question in the chat after the RCD one about common broom, and I mean there's actually one on the island that we call island broom. So it's the broom thing is a common name, and I exist in
right,
that space
right.
where I get to dwell in both common names and
Yeah,
Latin
yeah,
names.
yeah.
So if I start saying too much Latin, just throw
No,
something at me via Zoom and I'll
when
stop.
you're talking specifics, it's, right or wrong. Sometimes people don't like to hear it, but you kind of need it for a lot of these conversations sometimes. Um, all right, so continuing, can you talk a little bit about what constitutes an invasive plant and why we should care about that, and what does that mean for a place that's an island?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll kind of start broader and then focus in on the island part. So, and the California Invasive Plant Council is an organization that I really like, and they do an annual symposium, and I just submitted an abstract, and um, they kind of rotate between doing it hybrid or virtual. So it'll be a virtual symposium in October this year. But I think to go back to kind of CalIPSE's definition and kind of there's also a lot of formal definitions, so it gets a little convoluted because there's the California Department of Food and Agriculture. So a lot of what's a weed or a noxious weed actually focuses on kind of impacts to the agricultural system. I exist in kind of a different arm of that where we're really focused on natural areas, open spaces. For me, it kind of comes down to does it shift what the baseline of the ecosystem looks like? And that can take a few different characters to it. I mean, does that change the fire regime is one I go back to a lot. I used to live in Ventura before moving out to the island, so Ventura County, Arundodonax, and I know folks have probably seen it around Los Angeles too, the big giant reed that looks kind of like bamboo. That'll totally consume riparian systems, so rivers getting kind of choked out by stuff. So I think for me it kind of goes, I live in that ecological perspective. So does it shift what the ecosystem looks like? And then kind of zeroing in on the island perspective. Um, for us, it's like we exist in a pretty unique setting, and there's things that maybe are here that are still kind of you can still get ahead of those before they become the next genus lentifolia. One example I go to a lot, and you've seen this one around Southern California, even if you aren't paying attention, is the fountain grass, the Pennisetum cetaceum, which is a very, I mean, I think it really took off probably like 30 years ago when drought tolerant landscaping was becoming a thing. Um, the
Yes, yes, and yes.
yeah, the fountain grass, like, so we have fountain
Yeah,
grass out here, and none of it's on our property. It's all kind of a horticultural escapees, similar to that other story I told about. Well, fountain grass, I mean, so one of the things is I can get on a boat and then drive up PCH, and I can find canyons along PCH between Malibu and Ventura County that have been entirely consumed by fountain grass. And the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area does a great job managing it where they can, but or state parks also, but they can't get everywhere. And once it takes over a cliff, you're kind of in a tricky spot. And we're like
yeah,
on that other end of that. And if you get a disturbance that comes in, and to finish that thought on the island aspect, we're in this unique situation where we can have things get out here that we know are still early, and we might be able to like nip those in the bud, so to speak, before they really
right,
become
right,
the
right.
next thing that eats everything.
And can you talk a little bit how this doesn't just impact plants, it impacts the entire ecosystem,
Right.
animals, and everything from soil microbes on up,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Soil microbes, I mean, I think I'm not much of an entomologist, but like thinking about native insects, I appreciated the shout out for native bees earlier because I think a lot of times people think save the bees and people kind of just go to the European honeybee and they kind of lose the sight or they don't even have the knowledge that we have a whole huge diversity of native bees. We're still discovering new species on the Channel Islands. So if you have this whole kind of web of life and this ecosystem that developed, and then you have it shift towards this invasive plant that dominates it, yeah, maybe one other insect can do well with that, but are you losing the countless other insects that evolved with that system? Out here, I mean, the thing with islands is you might not have as many species as you do other places, but you get really unique things. So they're super dependent on that whole unique biodiversity. So the island fox is one example out here. We have an endemic ground squirrel out here. And then just thinking about, yeah, the invertebrates and the birds. So there's all kinds of fun, different things out here that if you lose that kind of baseline, and it's always kind of shocks me to remind myself of it, but like the plants really are the baseline of that whole system.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, in terms of your work, what are the biggest threats, challenges that are kind of really pressing right now in terms of potential damage that really need to be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different directions I could go with that question, and I see the comment about the RCD, and thankfully enough, the nice thing is Catalina Island Conservancy, we actually have a long-standing relationship with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and it's a bit funky because we're private land, so and we
Right, right,
technically
yeah.
count as a ranch. So the NRCS has actually been a really good partner. Yeah, I see the deer got brought up, and that was one of the directions I was going to mention. If you're thinking of it in terms of biggest threats, and this might be a good window for me to kind of step beyond kind of my invasive plant blinders here and talk about the larger scale Catalina Island Restoration Project. And this is where like the little slide deck I look reminded because it has kind of some of the history of the urbase introduced herbivores. So all the Channel Islands, there's 8 Channel Islands, Catalina being one of them. All the Channel Islands kind of have or California Channel Islands, I should say, because there's also like the Falcon. You could toss the Farallones in up north, and you could bring in the Baja Islands, and the Mexican version of the National Park Service does a really great job with some of the Baja Islands, the HESI, the Conservación y Calidad de Islas. They do a really good job. So there's kind of this whole history with all the islands of different animals that got introduced at different times. I mean, goats getting introduced, pigs getting introduced. Catalina is of the California Channel Islands, the one that still has introduced ungulates on it. So we have deer and bison. And so we do have a mule deer population on the island. We estimate it to be about 2,000 through spotlight surveys, and we did get permitted through the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to initiate a large-scale restoration project that would also include management of that mule deer population. And it's been controversial, to put it lightly, over the last few years. But if you look at the literature and kind of how things have gone at the other islands, it's pretty clear cut that removing introduced ungulates on these islands is one of the best actions you can take from a resilience perspective.
Let's connect the dots there just so people
Yeah.
kind of understand that. But so like even if we're talking about like something like the Cercocarpus traskii,
Yeah.
the tree that you said there's just 6 specimens left and that are the original purity. Um, and those are old specimens at this point. And
Hmm.
and one of the reasons, at least as I understand it, talking to Kevin and some other people there, one of the beliefs is that the saplings and stuff weren't really having to deal with ungulates before the deer were introduced. And so if a species evolves on an island when there's nothing like a deer, then they don't have defenses against a deer. They're not adjusted to a deer. The deer shows up. Am I on target there? Or give me
Yes,
some
yeah, you're
context.
100%. I mean, I think one of the ways to think of it with the vegetation specifically is things lose the adaptations that they have to herbivory in a lot of senses. So there's actually I think it was an undergraduate group that did this research, but they were out of Pepperdine, and they actually even grew some island plants on the mainland, and then like were able to show that those were preferentially browsed even on the mainland. So it's even things beyond just our endemics. Toyon, for example, is one that's not really a distinct one between the island and the mainland. If you really want to get goofy in the systematics, you could maybe try to split it out a little bit, but effectively it's the same toyon you have on the mainland. But even
Right.
our toyons out here are likely more susceptible to browse compared to mainland ones. And this isn't just a deer thing, it's a story of having goats and pigs on the island also. Goats
Right.
in particular are very impactful. So goats and pigs were controlled and are not present on the island at this point. Those control projects took place about 20 years ago. These projects have kind of taken place across the archipelago. So deer were present on Santa Rosa Island, and that project took place about 15 years ago. I used to work on Santa Cruz Island, and there were pigs present on Santa Cruz Island and also sheep. Sheep were never really a huge one on Catalina, although they were present at points. Yeah, I mean, I think, and at one point, Catalina was, and Santa Cruz too, were both kind of, and Santa Rosa, the 3 largest islands, were all kind of ranches at one point. And I think Wrigley figured out fairly early on, like they weren't really trying to run a ranch out here per se. I mean, they
Right.
have a private ranch and kind of horses, but like running like an actual cattle ranch was not. And the logistics are just a huge issue on that front.
One of the and again, correct me if you understand it differently, but one of the things that I commonly talk about when I'm giving tours in native plant areas is just the differences in the pernicellifolia subspecies. So
Yep.
then I'm talking about our native cherry trees, the
Yeah.
only evergreen cherry trees in the world, and they are in Southern California here. And the hollyleaf cherry, which is our mainland version of it, is a more shrub-like, and it has rather strong burrs on all the leaves,
Hmm.
which discourage browsing. And then the ones that jumped over to the islands, in particular Catalina, had has is a larger form through natural evolution, and kind of it still has the burrs on the seedlings, but once they get larger, you really don't see those nearly as much. And it's got
Yep.
a different shape, which again is because it didn't have the competition from the browsing and things along those lines.
Yeah, we kind of get two on the plant front. We'll get like two different things out here. We'll get paleo-endemic and neo-endemics. So effectively,
Mhm.
a neo-endemic is something that got out here and then speciated. So it's like a lot of our things that lost their adaptations from the mainland are what you would consider neo-endemics. And then you've got things like our ironwood trees, which are paleo-endemics that used to be more widespread and then have contracted in range over time with climate change and
Relic
land use.
species. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Relic species. And the ironwood's a really interesting one. I thought of it when you were describing the difference on the prunus subspecies, because we actually have a subspecies of ironwood out here that's only on Catalina. And the difference between that and the other Channel Islands is the leaves, whether they're compound or pinnate or complete. And so ours, when they're young, they look like the other one, but then as they get older, the leaves are actually complete. And it's resulted in an interesting little quirk for me because the you buy it in the horticultural trade and it's called Catalina ironwood, but that's actually the subspecies from Santa Cruz Island. So you'll sometimes get people wanting to plant the wrong subspecies out here. So
Pet
I
peeve
get
of
to look.
mine. But he's talking about the gorgeous ironwood trees in the two different versions. And for those of you who don't know those leaf terms, but essentially the one that is the Santa Cruz Island or the other islands one looks kind of like a fern, and then
Yeah, the
the
common name is actually fern leaf ironwood. So
yeah,
there's
and
a good example where the common name actually comes in handy because it tells you what
sure.
it and that subspecies also on Santa Rosa and Clemente Island, interestingly enough, and then we have a separate subspecies on Catalina. So the way some of this shook out is just really interesting. And then the prunus thing, super interesting too, because I know the Catalina subspecies you can find it at places on the mainland, and from a long time ago. So that suggests that Gabrielina Tongva moving things around. And
Yeah.
that's also one of the reasons our oak story gets so interesting out here too, is because you get these very interesting hybrid oaks. And we could spend the whole time just talking about like soapstone bowls and trade networks. Um, but I
I
won't.
would be up for that, but I don't know if,
I
how
think
far we want to
plants,
go down the
I
hole.
think plants
Yeah.
and restoration and climate aspects are where I won't go take us too off kilter.
So tell me a little bit about the actual, I mean, the work you are actually doing in the field. Is that mostly volunteer based? I mean, it's not just Aaron out there doing plant removal by himself. How does that kind of work in terms of certain times of the year that you focus on this more?
Yeah, we do different things, different time of years, but it's a pretty small core crew. So it's myself and I have a direct report under me, a lead technician. He's super solid and doing a great job. And then there's two technicians under him who are actually employed through the California Institute of Environmental Studies. So they're another partner organization that's based out of kind of Davis and Ventura and work with a lot of other partners in Channel Islands National Park and the Nature Conservancy on Santa Cruz Island. So they're actually back to the Natural Resource Conservation Service through their environmental quality incentives program. We've been able to fund some of that work. But yeah, really, it's a crew of four with contractor support at other times of the year.
That's
Volunteers
a
do some.
lot. I mean, that's a very small crew for 42,000 acres.
It is. So it's definitely a huge part of bringing in partners and contractors and getting support when we can. We are looking, I mean, I think especially post Palisades and Eaton Fire, but even before that, there's a lot of support out there from the state for fuels work. And that was kind of one of my goals when I got in was like, well, we have so much broom around Avalon that is a fuels problem, and I'd be able to kind of thread that needle of classifying that invasive species as a fuels project. So we've got a lot of work that's going to be starting with Conservation Corps of Long Beach too. So working with kind of like the local Conservation Corps to do broom removal. And yeah, volunteers definitely fit in there too. But I mean, sometimes it's not the volunteers' idea of a fun time to be out there digging fennel. I mean, the thing
Yeah.
with my techs are they are paid. They might not want to be working in invasive plants for the rest of their life. And I find most people want to like actually get a job doing stuff with wildlife or native plants or something. But that being said, doing some time as an invasive plant person really. So it's a
You got to
mix.
have both. I mean, you can't,
Yes.
we can't have
And
pretty things if we don't do the work to keep them safe.
yeah, and I think it's one of my short lines is it's one of the most cost-effective investments I think you can actually make in conservation is invasive plant management. And kind of what the work actually looks like. I mean, we do all kinds of different treatment for different taxas. So everything from physical manual removal, we do use herbicides. So we kind of approach that through an integrated pest management framework. We do a lot of what we call cut stump. So with the broom, you actually cut it at the base and then you apply
Right.
herbicide directly to that cut stump because otherwise it would grow back. And I mean, I think herbicides have been a particularly salient issue recently, and they have been for me with the big scale restoration project. That's actually something the community out here has. We just had our municipal elections, and one of the council candidates was kind of expressing concern with not necessarily specifically the Conservancy's herbicide program, but kind of herbicide use in general in the hills. And I mean, I'm the qualified applicator license holder. I am certified through the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. I do all our reporting to LA County. So I take it very seriously. And it's not something where we're just out there kind of broadcast
Right.
spraying across the landscape. We're doing specific targeted application to invasive plants to try to,
Which has kind of been the argument in Orange County right now is that they're going into watersheds
yes,
and just kind of
yeah,
filling it up with,
thing on the riparian corridors. So that's been one I've kind of watched as it's played out in the press. And kind of what'll happen a lot of time with these herbicide discussions is you'll get kind of like you'll have the application, you'll get kind of the pushback, and then it'll be a blanket pause, and then eventually they'll kind of swing back somewhere in the middle, ideally, where there is still at least some judicious use that can occur. Because I remember with the Orange County one, I remember reading the article, and then one of the folks from the group that was kind of publicizing a lot of the work was like, well, this is going to be great to have a natural riparian system. And I totally appreciate that and support that. But at the same time, if you don't use any herbicide, you might be looking at a system that becomes all Arundo or salt cedar, so giant reed, or because I've spent
right.
time on those
Those are
kind of
both
and
invasive plants he's mentioning
Mhm.
for everybody.
Yeah, salt cedar and giant reed are like two of the dominant riparian weeds in the Southwest, just take over whole rivers. So, I mean, and the flood, yeah, and I saw some of the photos. So there was maybe some stuff going on there that could have been done differently. But at the same time, I try to remind folks through an integrated pest management perspective, you don't want to lose one of the tools in your toolbox as a land manager. And it's on the land manager to be a good steward and not be doing things on the landscape that are irresponsible or impactful. And I mean, one thing I go back to too is every management action has consequences, whether that's even not doing anything, that's going to have consequences. Or like with the broom, for instance, I could have a crew go up and try to weed wrench them out on a slope, but then am I actually creating more erosion and damage than I would have otherwise? So it's
Not to mention
sometimes a
they're hard to
tricky
get
one,
to.
but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. All right, so I have monopolized your time here,
Oh
but
no, it's all good.
no. I just wanted to make sure we open it up to questions from everybody else here. Before I do that, though, I want to ask you a question I ask at the end of my interview portion usually, which is, what do you do when you're working on a problem and you just, you're either being told no by powers that be over and over again, and you can't get past it, and you just feel like it's a hurdle you can't overcome. What do you do personally? Just kind of double down and keep doing this good work.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is one I think about a lot because I think that's a very, I mean, I know it's a common thought in kind of the climate space, but I think it's one that we share a lot in the invasive plant world because I think it's easy to like kind of be overwhelmed that am I actually making a difference or and so for me it's kind of getting back in nature ideally because if I'm spending too much of my time at my computer, I notice that can be an issue, but I'm a big bird watcher, so I just got to go out to like the Eastern Sierra and spend some time out there, which was great, but just being, and then the really amazing thing was I got back to Catalina. I was as excited as I was looking at the crest of the Sierra to be looking at the backside of Catalina. So for me, it's just spending time in nature. I mean, it's time with my family. I mean, we get so much amazing, and that kind of reminds me of why I do what I do. And yeah, having a kid certainly has changed my aspect a little bit. So it's kind of like, yeah, I would want my kid to be living in something that feels safe and sustainable down the line. So that's kind of, yeah, those touchstones of why you do what you do. And for me, it's like the natural world and family. So both of those help a lot. And I like reading a lot too. So sometimes just switching off and reading a book that doesn't have anything to do with what I'm doing,
There you
that
go.
helps also.
Well, and to the
But then I go
birdwatching
back to
point,
botany. I go back to thinking about plants.
yep, yeah. To the birdwatching point, Catalina is now one of the best places to spot bald eagles. So,
Yes.
it's a
Yeah, I
whole
see
different
bald
element
eagles.
that we haven't discussed here tonight. So, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't maybe subconsciously I didn't go to the birds too much, but great spot to see all kinds of cool stuff out here. Yeah, especially if you get out in the hills. Well, that's another little quirk of our linguistics out here, I guess. The interior is, I think, what I'm supposed to say, but the the
Oh, is
the
there a
undeveloped
language
part
that
of it.
you're not supposed to use certain language over
I
there? Is
think
that
there's
right?
just certain words that are the preferable ones, and the hills
Gotcha.
is definitely the local one. And
It's always branding, right?
I've taken to the hills one more than I've taken to Overtown, so I do like calling the interior the hills.
Okay, fair enough. So I want to open it up to questions from everybody. Please note that if you put questions in the chat, I do a terrible job of monitoring the chat while I'm doing the interview. So I probably didn't get to your question if it's in the chat. So please just raise your hand and let's ask it so we can actually have the interaction. So at this point, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll have some questions for Aaron while we've got the wonderful opportunity to speak to him here. I know there's a lot of people in the conversation who I recognize from CNPS groups, from other that's CNPS is California Native Plant. We also mentioned RCDSMM, which is the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains. And we throw out these acronyms a lot of times and then just expect everybody to know them. What do we got? Go ahead and raise your hands. Here's what happens every time we do this, Aaron. Everybody's really, really shy and they don't want to ask the first question, and nobody raises their hand until usually Andy takes pity on me and raises his hand. And then what happens is at the end of the time that we have, there's like five people are raising their hands because they're enjoying the conversation and suddenly they want to ask questions. So if you're one of those people, raise your hand now and ask your question because you've got an opportunity to do it now instead of being cut off at the end. Still nobody's raising their hands. Let's go ahead and turn the spotlights off. Let's see if I can do this. Jordan's raised his hand. Jordan, you're up.
Hey, thank you, Charles. Aaron, thank you. Having a good time here learning about managing invasive plants. I run removal of invasive plants, RIP, over here in the Pacific Palisades with Resilient Palisades. So we're quite active on a lot of MRCA land, currently in Temescal Canyon Park. But on my off days, which honestly I pretty much pull weeds every day of the week whenever I get a chance to. I kind of have this mentality, and I'm new to this, several years new. If I see weeds, I pull them. I know there's often times where there's going to be land where you got to get permission. I I just know, and maybe I'm wrong because I'm naive to this, that the longer I wait for someone's approval, let's say, depending on the severity of like the signage that says like trespassing is illegal and whatnot, I sometimes still just go for it. I pull the weeds and I do it respectfully, of course. And I know when I'm pulling, I'm not just going out there with a weed whacker and cutting everything down. I know exactly, I know what I'm targeting. What do you think about that?
I think it's fine. It doesn't work perfectly for me because I could like pull my blinds here and unblur the back and I could show you some tree of heaven that's like on the property behind me. And it's like the one tree of heaven population in the city of Avalon and I would love to like but I'm not gonna like start going on somebody's property and doing that, especially where I live because I live in kind of a one of the nice things about going to mainland is you're like, oh, nobody knows who I am here. Whereas out here, you're like, oh, we're in a small town that's like 3,000 people, so we all can. And I have kids, so we like know most of the people in town. But the aspect of pulling stuff when you have the opportunity is good because I mean, I just saw a talk that had a good, or I was looking at an old slide deck from somebody from the Laguna Canyon Foundation. It was like 1 year of seed, five. It was either 5 or 7 years of weeds. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
and I mean, you got to kind of have that programmatic perspective. And I mean, the hard answer that I'm going to sound like I'm equivocating, but it depends on what species you're talking about, in my opinion. Like certain like, and hey, if it's one castor bean and you get that thing before it drops all that seed, like that's great. Or, I mean, the one that's really bad, and this is a tough one. Like, I don't know how bad it is in the southern part of the Santa Monicas, but it's getting pretty bad further up, and it's gotten really bad on Palos Verdes, and we haven't found it out here yet, but I'm worried about it. Is it's called Euphorbia terracina, which
Mm,
is it's a spurge.
yeah. Yeah.
So that's one that's
And an
like
irritant if you're trying to pull it out
yeah,
by hand. Yeah.
latexy, waxy sap that you don't want to
Yeah.
get on your skin. So that's the reference I would toss out is once again the California Invasive Plant Council because they kind of do this more systemic ranking of all the different species, and then you can sometimes find what's called a WRIC, a Weed Research Information Sheet, which comes out of UC Davis. A lot of it, like Davis has done a lot of the research, so you can actually find. And oh, there's a great tool, and actually I'm going to put it in the chat because this tool is great, and they just came out with it, and it's called Weed Cut, and it can actually kind of give you all kinds of recommendations on what to do. And I'll stop there because I could spend the rest of the night talking about just that question. It's a great question. It's what I think
Thank you.
about pretty much every day at work.
Oh
And
yeah.
thank you for what you do. And I think we've maybe crossed paths before because you know
You
Bill,
look
right?
familiar. Yeah, I
Yeah,
work with Bill often. I mean, I think
yeah.
during the summertime right now
I think
we're
I saw
taking a
him
hiatus,
is on
but
here too, so I've known Bill. a little bit through the weed management. I
Yeah.
should also have mentioned I'm on the board for the South Coast chapter of CMPS, and I'm involved with the weed management area. So the local CMPS chapters are good to get in sync with if you're interested in your area, and we kind of have three across the LA area, depending where you are, or Orange County too. But then the weed management area for LA County, we just had a meeting, and that's a good entity to kind of talk. That's a potential avenue to find whether it's tricky if it's just a private landowner, but if it's like a municipality or a park, like usually you can hopefully track down who the resource manager is and talk to them. And hopefully they're like a friendly person who wants to get help because we all need help in this space.
I see Elise has a question.
Yes, and it helps not to be on mute. So for that, sorry, I don't remember the name of the official name of the Ada's Garden.
Oh, yeah, the Wrigley Memorial and Botanic Garden.
Yes, thank you.
Hmm.
Bit of a mouthful. Uh,
Yeah.
it was really wonderful to see natives that have prospered there, but being all intermixed, how do you work with that?
Yeah, the Botanic Garden, for folks who haven't been out and seen it, and it's kind of another place in Avalon that I think folks sometimes don't get to because it's just like not on the beaten path, or they rent a golf cart and drive up there and then they don't want to pay the 15 bucks or whatever to get in. If you come out a lot, just become a conservancy member because then you can get in for free. And it's a great place. We go walk around their stuff and great trail access through there. But it's the Wrigley Memorial because it's actually where William Wrigley was buried after he died for about 10 to 20 years before they moved him over to the mainland around World War II. And then it kind of fell into disrepair. And it would, to Elise's point, it was actually Ada Wrigley, who was William Wrigley's wife. It's where they kind of put her garden. And the story I've heard, which may not be true, Joseph Vickers, who works up there, would be able to tell you better than me. He's a great storyteller and knows the history amazingly. But one of the things I've heard is they liked having plants from the places they've traveled. So there's kind of, to your point, there's kind of like an interesting disjunction in there where you kind of got like the entrance and then you've got kind of some horticultural sort of stuff from like the Canary Islands and stuff like that. And then you get closer up to the top and it's much more native. And then if you look up around the hillsides, there's actually a ton of Genista up there that I'm hoping to, or the broom that I'm hoping to move the needle on. And it kind of comes down to a philosophical discussion, I think, of like what is a botanic garden and what it should have. And different botanic gardens skew differently in this sense. And I think in general, California botanic gardens do amazing. They're a wonderful stakeholder. And I think that's true of ours. They're wonderful stakeholders of the native biodiversity from a botanical perspective of California. And there is an aspect too that there are collections and actually it opens up a whole interesting can of worms and I won't go into it, but there's actually another euphorbia. We were talking about Euphorbia terracina as a potential introduction. There's a bigger spurge. It's like a tree spurge and there was some confusion on the taxonomy that I won't get into. But this euphorbia has actually spread a little bit around Avalon and it's like a Canary Islands endemic that's probably not found anywhere else other than if you go to the Canary Islands. So to that point, it's like, well, and I've talked to them and I'll get going. I'll get a kick up my pants and start managing that one better. But there's yeah, those you never that's the thing. You sometimes don't know what's going to really establish. And I think there is an aspect philosophically, and you do want to maintain collections because you don't just have to be a purist. It has to all be native at a botanic garden, but you need to be watching, are any of these things actually taking off? So it's a good question that I don't have a perfect answer to, but in general, watching out for things that could become problematic. And then, yeah, it's just in that area, we'll see. I mean, the Conservancy sometimes goes through these kind of like planning exercises, and I think there were some ideas about how to modify things up there, but we're pretty at capacity with the restoration project in terms of like rethinking some of these areas. So down the line, you could maybe see some more native representation, but I think there's still and the cactus. I mean, for instance, I've not really other than like the one of the cactuses that, and that's the I won't get into the whole cactus story of California with the
The
mission
really huge
cactus,
one
but
that's only
yeah,
like four in the world or whatever.
that one, and then there's a different one that's the mission cactus that was the one the Spanish brought up that like has hybridized. So the cactus thing gets kind of messy, but I will say
Mhm.
like there's some really cool cactuses over there. And like I'm a native purist, but I love seeing both the ocotillo and the bujum tree that are in that cactus section when they're flowering because it's like I get to see these plants that I'd have to go to either Baja or Ansborrego to see, and I can see them flowering here.
And it's kind of an interesting thing that you're balancing history. I mean,
Yeah.
botanical gardens were like a real thing that was very, very popular 100 years ago to show everything around the world, kind of like a zoo kind of a thinking,
Yeah.
and we have a much different perspective on saving the local things today than I think was in existence 100 years ago. But you have that history of that space, and so it's kind of balancing these different priorities in terms of what's going on.
And it's inherently what we do as an organization too, because it's not just conservation that's our mission. It's also recreation and education. So we do have this kind of three-part mission, and there is the aspect of telling the story of Catalina. So it's these are the plants that Ada Wrigley had planted here as her garden.
Right.
Yeah.
One of my biggest allies in the whole fight against invasive non-native plants is Annette Mercer, who's got her hand up, and she's also in my book the one who coined the phrase that weeding becomes a disease that you're infected for life, kind of a thing that I anticipate you would relate to some extent, Aaron. But
I caught
Annette,
that at
yes,
some point.
you had Annette and I worked together on the Westwood Greenway project. So Annette, go ahead with your question.
Hi, yes, disease. We were stricken today. Um, my question is, if you have a native plant nursery with local island plants, that's part of the question. And then when you are taking out non-natives, do you leave the bare ground or do you try to replant with something native to, not to let the invasives jump right back?
Yeah, both great questions. And the first one's easier because we do have a nursery out here, the Ackerman Native Plant Nursery, and Charles has been out there. We've seen each other there before, and the nursery does a great job. The nursery's kind of gone through a few different itinerations over the years, where at one point kind of operated as a pseudo-commercial nursery, and that didn't really work great since it's like a 30-plus minute drive out of town. So at this point, the nursery is all about kind of growing plants both for conservation and then getting them to partners. I talked about the education aspect. The part I missed there is that there's actually a bunch of camps and coves along the channel side of Catalina, so yacht clubs and then educational camps. So like if anybody has a kid or has kids who went to like Catalina Island Marine Institute, that's Toyon Bay and Fox Landing, and then the Boy Scouts are over at or the Scouts are over at Emerald Bay, and there's a few other camps. So the nursery does a great job getting plants out onto the landscape in that sense, and kind of using that as a. So the nursery does a great job of kind of ex situ conservation, like, and they're doing some really cutting edge stuff in regards to propagation. Kevin, who Charles mentioned, is actually kind of pioneering some of this micropropagation where you're basically cloning plants, and they're really good at doing cuttings and that sort of stuff. So everything from kind of the common taxa all the way to the rarest taxa, they're getting really good at kind of propagating these things. And so that kind of segues nicely to the second part of the question of what we do. Unfortunately, with the deer present on the island, we don't see a lot of success with planting, and we're also water limited out here. So we're not necessarily doing a ton of revegetation right now where we remove things. And one of the problems with the broom that we spend a lot of time with is the seed bank is very robust. So kind of what we're hoping to move towards big scale down the line is actually a more seed-based approach to restoration. So rather than treating an area and then going in and planting small plants in containers, we would actually apply seed. And then ideally then when you get natural rainfall, that would instigate those seeds to start expressing on the landscape. And then kind of to your point about bare ground is sometimes we don't actually know what's in that seed bank there. Some of these genista dominated areas, we feel pretty confident that it's all broom, but some of these areas, I mean, we see, and I think it's easy to fall into that trap of thinking fire's all bad. And we had a big fire out here, the island fire that burned about 10% of the island, and it was a very traumatic thing out here, and it burned all the way up to Avalon. But some of the areas that burned after, that, especially the ones that were fenced off, we've seen good recovery where things have done well. So we have a manzanita that's only found out here. So it's a tough one, but yeah, the seed kind of based approach is what we're hoping to work towards, especially because that addresses the water aspect. We didn't touch on water in Catalina too much, but we have had some water issues out here at points. I mean, during the last big drought, they were even getting to the point out here where they were asking tourists to take shorter showers, which if something is impacting tourism out here, it's a substantial issue because we're kind of a tourist-based community in Avalon. And I'll
I
stop
do
there.
want to point out our appreciation that at Westwood Greenway, we've actually had some of those plants from Kevin and the Ackerman Nursery that you can come see at Westwood Greenway. Some of those species that are quite rare are there now. So I got time for two more questions, and that's it. So that's the cutoff, and then we'll wrap up because we'll try to keep the trains running on time here. So Andy, you're up.
Okay, sorry. I have to ask about water, especially since you have extensive experience. Sorry. So since Avalon is an island, and water is a precious resource there, do you think that native plants are again, one of the best ways to conserve water, or what are other ways to, again, just install sustainable water infrastructure? Like, what are valuable methods to secure, establish water security for Avalon and for LA County, I should ask.
I mean, it's a great question, and I think I can speak to the latter one better than the former. I mean, I think local is good, and I think we're seeing a lot of that happen. With Catalina specifically, it's tricky. So the way our water profile is, it's about 60% comes from a reservoir in the middle of the island, and then the other 40 is desal. And there's a big condo development called Hamilton Cove that was put in as part of the entitlements for Hamilton. They put desal in. So we do get, and so I think in general, I'm not a huge. I used to live up in Santa Barbara in addition to Ventura, and I mean Huntington. There was a desal project proposed there, so I mean in general, I'm not like super gung ho on desalination. Although I think Catalina is a good exception to that. It's a little tricky too because for me, the water part, at least especially on the island, but other places too, it becomes an energy discussion too. And I won't get too into the energy part on Catalina, but we're not really very on the green energy train out here, and I think that would be a good room for growth. It's a challenging thing because we don't have a lot of developable land, and I mean, redeveloping in Avalon's a real challenge, and we're just site limited. So, I mean, it would be great. And Edison is working on stuff out here. They are working to, and they do have some strategies they're working on, but obviously they're not just the provider for Catalina, they're the provider for the entire region. And then they don't just do our, I'll finish with this. Don't just do our water or our electricity. Edison also does all our water out here and our gas. So they kind of are the thing that keeps everything running out here.
And with respect to green energy out there, we got to get all those damn golf carts off of of the two
Yeah,
parking sheds and onto
from
electric. Oh,
from a grid perspective, and even just from like a local noise perspective, I think if you could work towards kind of a different gas, non-gas powered golf cart, you could really be
yeah.
the green golf cart tour out here.
Yep. 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 All right, David, you're up.
Hey, yeah, so we had very good luck with AmeriCorps volunteers doing the
Yep.
conservation work around where I live. And, most of the groups I was in at the time were older volunteers. And, you'd get these really gung-ho 19 to 24-year-olds. And man, you could get a lot of work done. Have you had any experience with AmeriCorps?
Yes, we actually just we had a long-standing relationship with a outfit called American Conservation Experience, and it wasn't strictly AmeriCorps, but it was a similar kind of program for emerging professionals in conservation. And I'll biasedly admit that my partner, who's a wildlife biologist now for the Conservancy, she was actually one of the technicians about 10 years ago working for the program I now manage. So we've got and it's kind of like I said earlier, they don't necessarily always decide this is the career they want to work in for the rest of their life, but it's a really good introduction to conservation. And I mean, it's not always the easiest work removing invasive plants, but as I've harped on a couple times, it's such a valuable thing. And I'm pretty much an all of the above person on who I can get involved with, whether that's, I mean, I had a guy who was out here who was probably in his 50s who was gung ho to come take out Janista with me. So we set up with a weed wrench and went and looked for it. And yeah, getting some folks out at college or getting the right group. I mean, sometimes it becomes a competition with the right young group. They're racing,
Right.
even the school kids from out here, like you'll have them doing digging fennel and they're racing for who can get the biggest one or get the most. So. Not to endorse the gamification of invasive plant work, but whatever works to get people on the landscape doing stuff, I think is
Excited about it.
worthwhile.
Yeah. Yeah. Aaron, you've been absolutely wonderfully engaging and a fountain of knowledge, and we truly appreciate you being here this evening. And we look forward to our relationship with our organization and the Conservancy going forward and building stronger ties. And just want to thank you for your time, your generosity, and your knowledge. So.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for coming out. I feel like this is a pretty good crowd of folks for watching me on a Sunday night. So, thank you so much, and
Well, we
appreciate
dig
it.
it.
And
We dig it very much,
looking for,
and
yeah.
we're definitely going to have a group out there very soon. So, hopefully we'll be able to see you when that happens.